Racist woman stole land from Big Shaq like it was hers to claim. Laid concrete over history and called it progress. But what looked like silence was strategy. Big Shaq didn't raise his voice. He raised a legacy. When roots run deeper than concrete, revenge doesn't knock. It reclaims. And this time, the driveway leads straight to justice. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. Share in the comments below. The Georgia heat didn't bother Big Shaq. He liked how it settled into his bones, reminded him he was home. His boots pressed into the dry earth, leaving thick prints behind as he crossed the wide, open stretch behind the old house. The house wasn't anything fancy. 2 stories, porch that wrapped around like a hug, and wood siding that needed repainting. But it stood strong, like him, like the land it sat on. 6 acres. That's what he inherited. But what it meant to him couldn't be measured in acres or deeds. It was his father's sweat soaked into the soil, his mother's voice echoing from the kitchen, and the echoes of his daughter's first footsteps in the backyard. The trees along the property line weren't just trees. They were sentinels, guardians of a legacy. They'd seen barbecues, funerals, and long, silent nights when grief hung heavier than the southern air. Shaq had been many things: athlete, investor, public figure. But here, he was just a man, just Shaquille, walking the land that had raised him, reminded of who he was before the fame, before the noise. Lucille O'Neill sat on the porch swing, her gray hair tucked into a red scarf, eyes sharp beneath the wrinkles of time and wisdom. She didn't call out to him. She didn't need to. He knew she was watching, the same way she always had since he was a boy big enough to lift fence posts with his bare hands. "You feel that under your feet?" she asked when he finally came up the steps and sat beside her. He looked at her, sweat glistening on his forehead. "That dirt has your blood in it. Don't ever let him forget." He nodded. No need to speak. Her words were gospel, handed down like hymns in church. The town of Hawthorne Ridge was the kind of place where everyone knew your father, your sins, and the last person you brought to Sunday service. Small, winding roads, front yards, with flags and porch chairs that never seemed to move. People nodded when Shaq passed by, some with genuine warmth, others with a politeness they thought covered their unease. Most folks liked him, liked the idea of him, at least, the big gentle giant, they called him. Always gave to charity, never raised his voice in public, helped build a community center near the church, bought school supplies for every kid in the district 3 years running. He was familiar. But not everyone liked having him right there on 6 whole acres, in a neighborhood where his kind hadn't lived with so much space for so long. They didn't say it out loud, not with words. But Shaq had learned to read, between handshakes and small talk, in the way some folks tightened their smiles just a little too much when he drove by in his truck, in the way some conversations at the diner paused when he stepped through the door. Still, he held his peace. He had his land, his family, and his mission. Nara, his teenage daughter, came down every weekend. She loved the land too. She'd walk barefoot through the grass, headphones in, hair wild and free. Lucille always warned her about snakes, but the girl never flinched. "Ain't afraid of nothing that slithers," she'd laugh. There was power in the way Miara moved through the world. Unbothered, brilliant, she carried the O'Neill name like a crown, and Shaq saw pieces of his younger self in her, only braver. That Saturday morning started like any other. Miara had left early with friends. Lucille was shelling peas on the porch, and Shaq was walking the perimeter, counting trees like he always did. But something in the air felt off. He stopped near the south end of the property, where the land dipped before rising toward the back road. The grass had been flattened, and tire tracks scarred the dirt. Deep, thick treads cut right through his land, curving off toward the hill. He followed the trail with heavy steps, boots crunching over broken twigs and crushed weeds. As he crested the rise, he saw it, a long stretch of fresh concrete, still drying, pale gray, and perfectly shaped. A driveway. And it wasn't his. It sliced clean through his southern boundary, bending gently toward the house that sat just beyond the tree line, the Whitmore estate. Shaq stood still, not blinking. His hands clenched slowly at his sides, not from rage, but from restraint. He turned on his heel and walked back toward the house. Lucille saw his face before he even reached the steps. What did they do? He sat down, slow, silent. Lucille stood, her old bones moving with quiet fury, and walked into the house. When she returned, she held a manila envelope full of documents. Old ones, handwritten surveys, copies of land deeds, receipts from decades ago. Everything that proved what he already knew. "This is yours," she said, tapping the papers. It always was. The Whitmore family had owned the land, up the hill since before anyone could remember. Their property backed against Shaq's southern fence. Over the years they'd made small moves, planting trees inches over the line, complaining about noise, making subtle remarks at HOA meetings. But this wasn't subtle. This was theft. Constance Whitmore was the matriarch. Widowed, white, sharp-tongued and used to being obeyed. She hadn't spoken to Shaq much since she moved back after her husband's death. The one time they did speak, she had gestured to the field between their homes and said, "Shame to see all that land go to waste." He'd replied, "It's not wasted. It's home." She didn't smile. He made his way up the hill that evening, the sun bleeding orange across the sky. When he rang the bell, a young man in a vest opened the door. Constance's caretaker. Maybe. He didn't speak, just disappeared inside. Minutes later, she appeared in the doorway, crisp white shirt, pearls at her neck, not a hair out of place. "I was wondering when you'd come knocking," she said, folding her arms. Shaq looked past her toward the driveway.
"That ain't your land."
She tilted her head. "You sure about that?" He didn't answer. "I had my team check the records. They said the boundary's a bit messy, not exactly clear." She smiled. "Besides, it's just a driveway. You've got plenty of space." He stared at her, his silence heavy. She leaned in, lowering her voice just enough. "You don't need all that land, Mr. O'Neill. Let's be real. You'll never do." Shaq didn't blink, didn't flinch. "You done?" he asked. Constance straightened. "I suggest you let it go. It's already built. No point wasting time or money, fighting something that's already poor." He nodded once, turned, and walked away. No yelling, no threats, no cursing, just steps. Steady, firm, unbothered. But inside something had shifted. Not just anger, not just insult, violation. That night he sat with Lucille and Nera, at the dinner table. The food was untouched. "She looked at me like I was dirt," he said, his voice low. "She's scared," Lucille said. "Scared because you remind her the world's changing, and she ain't in charge no more." Mira leaned forward. "You gonna let her keep it?" Shaq looked at them both, then down at his hands. "I'm gonna show her what it really means to build something." The next morning he called a friend, a black surveyor from Savannah named Royston Tiller. He drove down that same week, walked every inch of the property, marked the lines with new flags. The verdict was clear. The driveway cut 30 feet into Shaq's land. It wasn't messy. It wasn't ambiguous. It was stolen. But when Royston submitted the official report to the county office, the response came back lukewarm. "Looks like an honest mistake," the clerk said. "Probably best to settle it civilly." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "You'd say the same if it was my concrete on her grass." The man didn't answer. The fight wouldn't be won through the courts. Not in a town where people like Constance had influence, history and power stitched into every brick of the courthouse. But Shaq didn't need the courts. He had something better. The land that raised him, and the will to protect it without ever throwing a punch. He stood beneath the old oak tree that night, staring toward the hill where her house lights glowed like a challenge. "This ain't over," he whispered. "Not by a long shot. You poured it across my land." She shrugged. Surveyors disagreed. "Lines are tricky out here, don't you think?" Shaq didn't blink. "You stole it." She tilted her head, let her voice drop. "Your kind don't need that much land anyway." There it was, not hidden, not veiled, raw, and still no raised voice from Shaq. No threat, just that long, calm stare that made her feel, for the briefest moment, like he saw something inside her, something rotted. "You'll hear from me," he said. "Oh, I'm sure I will." She smirked. "But let me save you some time. You'll lose. You always do." He walked away without another word, and Constance stood there watching his back, sipping what was now cold tea, her lip curling with the taste. That weekend, she hosted a brunch for a few of the remaining women from her garden club. Most had drifted over the years. Some passed, some moved, some simply chose not to return. But a few remained loyal. They wore wide hats and spoke in careful phrases. One of them, Evelyn, from Sycamore Lane, asked about the driveway. It looks long, she said cautiously. Constance chuckled. Had to stretch it some. Poor man next door can't seem to manage all that overgrown land. The other women chuckled nervously. Someone murmured, "He's such a kind man." Constance rolled her eyes. "He's a showpiece. Harmless. Keeps the press happy." Silence followed. A silence filled with a dozen unspoken judgments. But no one challenged her. They never did. Later that day, Constance stood at the top of her driveway, looking down at Shaq's land. The trees swayed in the warm wind. Somewhere a dog barked. Children laughed in the distance. She hated that sound. At night, she dreamt of fences. High ones. With spikes. She imagined the field empty. The trees gone. Replaced with manicured rose gardens and hedges. A neighborhood, polished and proper. One that looked like the old Hawthorne Ridge. But the truth she would never speak aloud haunted her. The town had changed. And no matter how much concrete she poured or how many complaint calls she made, it wasn't hers anymore. Not in spirit. Not in sound. And she would soon learn, not in ownership. Still, in her arrogance, she felt untouchable. That hill had always shielded her from consequences. She didn't see what was coming next. And that would be her greatest mistake. It was the kind of day that should have felt good beneath Shaq's boots. The sky was a broad sweep of cloudless blue, sunlight falling in golden waves over the Georgia pines. He had just dropped Mayra off at the station. She was headed back to college, her bag full of notes and dreams, her eyes sparkling with questions about legacy and land. She loved asking him things like, "Do you think they know how lucky they are to see you grow here? And what does the land remember, Dad?" Questions like that didn't come with answers. Not the kind you could put into words anyway. But this land, his land, remembered everything. It carried grief and celebration in its soil. It carried the past in its roots. That's why when Shaq turned the final bend on the gravel road, leading to his house, and caught sight of the trucks, 3 of them, loud, heavy, and already halfway through pouring wet concrete across the southern border of his land, he didn't stop the truck gently. He slammed the brake, the tires crunching into dirt and dried leaves, sending dust curling up behind him like smoke from a fire that had just been lit. For a second he thought maybe he was dreaming. Maybe this was some accident. Maybe a crew had taken the wrong road, misread some GPS. But then he saw it, the banner on the side of the lead truck, Whitmore Contracting Services. No mistake, no confusion. He stepped out of his truck slowly, his size towering against the smaller workers, most of whom looked away the second he appeared. But not the foreman. The man had a clipboard, a ball cap low over his brow, and an attitude that came with too many years of being told he was the man in charge. He turned when he saw Shaq coming, didn't offer a handshake. "What's this?" Shaq asked, his voice low, calm, but carrying weight like a roll of distant thunder. "Just finishing up a pour," the foreman said without looking him in the eye. "You're on private property, sir." Shaq stepped forward, just enough to make his presence clear, but not threatening. "Never. This is private property. Mine." The man flipped through a few pages on his clipboard and pointed toward the edge of the concrete, still steaming and soft under the sun. "We've got approval from the Whitmore estate. County signed off last week. If you got an issue, take it up with the office. We're just doing the job." Shaq's eyes didn't leave him. "You got approval to pour into someone else's land?" The foreman shrugged. "Not my fight." Shaq turned toward the fresh pour, walking the line with slow steps, stopping where the white flags marked what had always been his boundary. He'd walked this line with his father, dug fence posts with his uncle, even buried a dog near this exact patch as a child. This wasn't just land, this was memory, stolen in daylight. "You gonna move this?" he asked, still facing the pour, not the man. "We don't tear down what we're paid to build." Shaq exhaled through his nose, then turned back and walked away. He didn't raise his voice, didn't slam a fist into the side of the truck, didn't curse though he had every reason to. He climbed back into his truck, jaw set like concrete of his own, and drove straight into town. The county clerk's office sat on Main Street, tucked between an old bakery and a hardware store that still smelled of rust and pine. Inside it was cold with fluorescent lights, and the walls were lined with laminated posters about property rights and zoning law. Shaq stood at the front counter, waiting as the woman behind the glass flipped through a thick binder without urgency. He tapped the counter once. She looked up. "I need to file a complaint. Property infringement." "What address?" she asked, flat-toned. He gave it to her. "Reason? They poured a driveway into my land." She raised her brows, typing slowly. Name on the permit says Whitmore. He nodded. That's the problem. She pursed her lips. Might be a boundary issue. Common around here. Old maps, new measurements. I've walked that line for 20 years, Shaq said. I know where my land ends. Well, she replied, leaning back in her chair, maybe it's a misunderstanding. No need to stir up anything just yet. Stir up anything. He didn't say it, but the phrase crawled down his spine like a warning. The way she said it didn't mean calm. It meant don't cause a fuss. It meant stay in your place. It meant she's one of ours. You're not. I want it on record, he said finally, voice like iron. I want it documented that this was done without consent. She nodded once and slid a form under the glass. Fill it out. Might take a few weeks to get reviewed. A few weeks. He took the form, folded it neatly, and walked out without filling it in. Back at the house, Lucille was on the porch again. She didn't ask what happened. She'd seen enough in her lifetime to read the truth in the tight line of her son's mouth. They took it, she said quietly. He nodded. She shook her head. They don't take unless they think they can keep it. Shaq sat down beside her, elbows on knees. Lucille looked out at the sunset, voice sharp and low. They want you to get loud. They want you to fight in the street. That way they get to say, see, look how they behave. Don't give 'em that. I ain't gonna bark, Shaq said. But I ain't gonna roll over either. She reached out and patted his hand. Later that evening, he found himself driving back toward the hill, stopping just shy of where the new concrete curled into Constance Whitmore's gate, like a gray tongue claiming what wasn't hers. Her lights were on, her windows open. She stepped onto her porch as if she'd been waiting. He didn't say anything. Not yet. She looked him dead in the eye, not a flicker of guilt. Go ahead, she said, almost smiling. Sue me. You'll lose. You always do. He didn't flinch. Didn't even blink. You build anything else into my land, he said, voice steady. I'll find a way to take it all. Her smile twitched, but only slightly. You people, she said, turning back toward her door, always think you're owed something. Shaq stood there a moment longer, watching the concrete, the way it glowed under the porch light. It would harden by morning, just like her heart had hardened long ago. But he wasn't angry, not in the way she expected. He wasn't going to yell. He wasn't going to protest with signs or throw chairs at council meetings. She'd taken a piece of his land, but he was about to take something bigger. Not with fists, not with shouts, but with legacy. She thought this was just about a driveway. But this was war, and Shaquille O'Neal had learned long ago. The best wars are won without swinging once. Shaq took a breath. It stuck in his chest. I don't want to fight, he said. You won't, she replied. You'll plan. You'll outthink. That's what scares him most. Not your fists. Your patience. That conversation lingered in Shaq's chest the next few days, like an ember. He didn't speak about it to anyone. Didn't post on social media. Didn't give a soundbite to the local paper that tried to casually stop by for a quote. Instead, he walked his land at sunrise. He took out every deed, every boundary line, every survey, and spread them across his dining room table like puzzle pieces. And when he realized he couldn't fight this with just memory and paper, he made a call. Journey Caldwell didn't look like most lawyers Shaq had met. She didn't wear a blazer or carry a briefcase. When she pulled up to his home in a navy sedan, she stepped out in boots, black jeans, and a leather jacket. She was mid-30s, hair coiled tightly in a bun, gold hoops in her ears, a fire in her step that said she didn't wait for doors. She kicked them open. She didn't ask for a tour, didn't compliment the house. She went straight to the documents, reading with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. After half an hour of silence, she looked up. They built across your land. No question. You've got every legal right to sue. Would I win? Shaq asked, leaning against the counter. Journey exhaled. Depends. Whitmore's old money, old influence, small-town politics. So I lose? She smiled faintly. I didn't say that. Shaq waited. Journey closed the file, slid it aside, and leaned forward. We don't burn their houses, she said. We buy the land underneath it. The words hit like a chord. We move quietly, she continued. We trace tax liens, debt inheritance disputes. We work with the silence they gave us. And then we let them watch as the land answers for us. Shaq's lips curled, just slightly. I like that, he said. Good, Journey said. Because Constance Whitmore, she's not just a racist old woman. She's a cracked empire waiting to collapse. Over the next few weeks, Shaq let the world believe he was backing off. He attended a local charity gala, posed for pictures, donated a check to the school district's arts program, smiled as if nothing was wrong. All the while, Journey worked behind the scenes like a storm beneath the soil. She discovered Constance's estate had unpaid taxes, found loopholes in her late husband's corporate filings, identified several undeclared improvements made without permits, enough for the county to open a quiet investigation. She even found out about a disputed property line on the west side of Constance's estate, a strip of wooded land Shaq had always thought was someone else's, but which according to old maps might actually belong to the O'Neill legacy. Shaq didn't strike all at once. That wasn't the way of men like him. No, he let it build, let the tension coil like a rope. Each morning, he waved at the mailman, delivering letters to Whitmore Hill, knowing full well what sat inside. Liens, notices, audits. Every paper a whisper in her ear. You are not untouchable. One afternoon as he walked the edge of his property, he noticed Constance standing at the top of her hill. She wore sunglasses and a tight-lipped frown. She didn't wave, neither did he. The silence stretched long between them, but this time, it wasn't her silence that controlled the moment. It was his. That night, Lucille placed a plate of cornbread on the table, sat across from her son, and asked only one thing. You sure about this path? Shaq nodded. I've shouted my whole life without saying a word, he said. Now it's time they start listening. The land around them was still. The kind of stillness that comes just before the wind shifts. That quiet before a storm, not of thunder or rain, but of justice. And for the first time in weeks, Shaq slept soundly. Journey Caldwell saw them first. She sat across from Shaq in the living room, a thick folder spread across her lap, her fingers stained with ink, her phone buzzing every few minutes with updates from her research contacts. The woman worked like a chess grandmaster, 6 moves ahead, and no wasted motion. Shaq listened while she laid it out piece by piece. It starts with the shell companies, Journey said, pointing to a series of documents lined up on the coffee table. Her husband Richard Whitmore wasn't just a lawyer. He was moving funds through ghost LLCs registered in multiple states. Some had property attached. Others were pure fronts. All of it looks clean from the outside. But when you pull the records from the Secretary of State's office, patterns show up. Shaq leaned forward, scanning the line of corporations with strange names. Claremont Holdings, Timberwise Real Estate, Dunhill Ventures. None of them ever built anything, sold anything, or paid taxes in full. Money laundering, he asked. Journey nodded. Textbook. And here's the catch. The estate never closed those LLCs. That means any unresolved debts or unpaid taxes tied to those companies could land squarely on her personally. Shaq didn't speak for a moment. The wheels were already turning. She still thinks this is about a driveway, he said quietly. She has no idea she's living on a legal sinkhole. Journey replied. And we're just getting started. Over the next 10 days, Journey built a silent siege. She filed requests for tax audits, flagged improper asset transfers, contacted a paralegal in Atlanta who had once worked for the Whitmore estate. From her they learned about a piece of land, just under half an acre, that Constance had been trying to sell quietly off-market. It had gone unsold because of a pending zoning dispute. Journey made an offer through a third-party buyer. It was accepted. The next day, Shaq owned it. He did the same with 2 other parcels, one to the north, one to the east. Small lots, but strategically perfect. Together they wrapped around the Whitmore estate, like a noose of paperwork and law. No bulldozers, no headlines, just filings, notarized signatures, and silence. Lucille watched him from the porch as he returned from another quiet meeting in town. You building fences? She asked. No, he said. Just boundaries. She smiled at that, proud and tired. Meanwhile, the town began to shift. It started at the hair salon, where whispers ran faster than dye through roots. Cheryl, the owner, told her regulars that the Whitmore name was on thin ice with the bank. The mortgage hadn't been paid in 2 months. The county assessor had stopped by last week. Constance had slammed the door in his face, but the message was clear. Something was wrong. Then it reached the church. Pastor Hill didn't say her name from the pulpit, but his sermon touched on pride, on judgment, and on the sin of building on stolen ground. People murmured. Some nodded. A few clutched their purses tighter. Finally, it hit the Hawthorne Country Club. the one place Constance considered sacred ground. Her Friday lunch group had dwindled. The head of the committee, Nancy Bell, had pulled her aside and told her that perhaps it's best to lay low for a while. Constance didn't take that well. She returned home that afternoon, pearls tight around her throat, storm in her eyes. She stood at the edge of her property, looking out across the fields she once dismissed as overgrown and unkempt. Now those fields belonged to someone else. Someone who didn't need her approval, someone who didn't ask for permission. She called Darren, her assistant, and demanded an update on the properties surrounding her home. "I'm seeing a pattern," he said hesitantly. The parcels were purchased in cash, clean sales, quiet closings. By who? Can't say for certain. All went through holding companies. She gritted her teeth. Find out. Darren paused. One of the addresses, it's linked to an LLC registered to Caldwell Strategy Group. That name made her freeze. She'd heard it once. A podcast interview. Some upstart lawyer from Atlanta, who prided herself on flipping land from beneath corrupt corporations and racist institutions. The same lawyer who had been seen only once getting out of a sedan parked near the O'Neill home. Her breath caught. "No," she whispered. He wouldn't. But of course he would. Shaquille O'Neal had never shouted, never slammed a door, never called her out in public. But every move he made now was a slow, precise counter to hers. And it was working. One by one, her neighbors stopped waving. People who used to greet her at the grocery store now avoided eye contact. A teacher at the high school politely declined her donation to the choir fund. The tide had turned, and it hadn't needed a single protest sign to do it. Back at the O'Neill house, Shaq stood under the giant pecan tree, arms crossed as Journey explained the final play. "The bank's ready to foreclose," she said. She missed another payment. The estate's liabilities outweigh its liquid assets. And the property taxes she tried to dodge, they just matured. A lien is being placed next week. Shaq didn't smile. He didn't gloat. "She built her house on a hill," he said. "Thought it made her safe." Journey closed her folder and looked at him. Sometimes, the higher they build, the further they fall. Lucille walked by with a basket of greens from the garden, paused for a moment to listen, then nodded. "Just make sure," she said, "when the house falls, you're not standing underneath it." Shaq looked toward the top of the hill. "No," he said. "I'll be right where she can see me." And up on the hill, Constance sat at her kitchen table, letters from the county and the bank spread out like spilled wine. She clutched the pearls around her neck, as if they might hold her upright, might protect her from the truth that had finally found its way through her walls. The world was changing. The land was speaking. And for the first time in her life, Constance Whitmore had no idea how to silence it. At first she thought it was construction on the far side of the neighborhood, but as she stood at her bay window, clutching her second cup of black tea, the noise sharpened. It had rhythm, precision, not chaos control. She stepped out onto the porch, squinting against the sunlight. Down below, where her self-approved driveway stretched smugly into Shaquille O'Neal's southern property, a crew was working. Quiet, efficient, every man moved with purpose, like they were building something important. She didn't see trucks or bulldozers, just steel panels, long and black, being lifted and locked into place with satisfying finality. A fence, a tall one. It started at the edge of the eastern parcel Shaq had bought weeks ago, ran parallel to the line of pine trees, and bent like an elbow right across the concrete driveway she had poured without permission. By noon it was sealed shut by a matte black iron gate. Simple, sleek, with a digital lockbox and security camera angled downward like an eye that never blinked. Constance's mouth dried. She picked up her phone and called Darren. "They're building a fence," she said, sharp. There was a pause on the line. "On whose property?" he asked cautiously. "Mine," she snapped. "They're blocking my access." Another pause. "And actually, according to the plat maps we reviewed last month, the fence is entirely within the O'Neill boundary, legal setbacks included." She didn't answer, and since the driveway was poured without permission, click, she ended the call. By late afternoon, the true impact of Shaq's move had started to ripple. The mail truck stopped at the base of her hill, idled for a moment, and then drove away. Amazon did the same twice. Packages delayed. A formal notice posted on her front door from the delivery office stated, "Access road is obstructed by unauthorized gate. Alternate delivery route required." There was no alternate. Not anymore. For the first time in decades, Constance Whitmore felt something she couldn't fully name. Not just irritation, not just inconvenience, but a deep, gnawing sense of vulnerability. The kind of feeling she had spent her whole life building fences against. Now she was on the other side of one. And it wasn't just a fence. It was a message, one that required no yelling, no lawsuits, no crowds with signs, just steel and silence. 2 days passed before she saw him. Shaq was walking near the pecan tree by the road, checking one of the new motion sensors recently installed on his land. He was in work boots and a navy hoodie, a folder tucked beneath one arm, calm, composed, unbothered. She pulled up in her car, an aging but polished silver Cadillac, and rolled the window down. "You think this makes you better than me?" she called out, tone sharp as broken glass. Shaq didn't rush to answer. He turned slowly, looked her square in the face, and let the weight of the moment settle. "No," he said, "but it reminds you I never was beneath you." Her lips parted slightly, as if to speak. But nothing came out. "You chose concrete," he continued. "I chose boundaries." She tightened her grip on the steering wheel. "You're humiliating me." "I didn't pour that driveway across your land," he said. "You did that to me." "I was told the lines weren't clear." "You told yourself that," he cut in, calm but unwavering, "because you didn't think I'd do anything about it." He walked away without another word. No curse, no threat, just steps that echoed louder than any argument. The days that followed felt longer than usual for Constance. Her world, once wrapped in privilege and predictability, had begun to unravel in sharp, quiet ways. She went to town for groceries, only to find conversations ended when she entered the aisle. At the salon, Cheryl didn't even greet her, just kept sweeping. Even Pastor Hill, who had always smiled with gentle neutrality, only nodded once as she passed him outside the church. The whispers weren't whispers anymore. They were movement. The town had shifted. She was no longer seen as a matriarch, but a monument to something outdated and sour. Even her home began to feel colder. The driveway that had once brought her pride now led to a gate she couldn't open. Her pearls, once symbols of status, now felt like chains tight against her throat, choking reminders of the control she no longer had. Inside the Whitmore estate, her steps echoed louder than usual. The silence was unbearable. She had spent her life mastering control, of land, of people, of perception, but control built on arrogance is fragile. And when it breaks, it shatters. One morning she stepped outside to see a small group of children laughing near Shaq's fence. They weren't trespassing, just playing tag, the kind of game that echoes through generations like a language older than fences or laws. She wanted to yell, to tell them to move, to call someone. But the words caught in her throat. They weren't doing anything wrong. They were free, just like he was. And that was the part she couldn't stand. Shaq sat on his porch later that evening, sipping iced tea while Journey reviewed a few final property documents beside him. She was smiling, not out of spite, but out of strategy. The kind of smile that came from knowing you'd fought smart, not like. "She's quiet," Journey said. "Hasn't made a move in 3 days." "She will," Shaq said. "But now it's just noise." Lucille came out and joined them. She looked toward the hilltop and gave a small nod. "She's still wearing those pearls?" she asked. "Every day," Shaq said. "Some folks think if they tighten them enough they'll keep the truth from getting in." Journey leaned back in her chair, eyes scanning the horizon. "You've won the ground," she said. "What now?" Shaq looked at the gate, at the land, at the house that raised him. "Now I show them what to do with it." Because for him, this was never about just revenge. It was about something deeper. Something rooted. Constance may have built a driveway with stolen confidence, but Shaq, he built a legacy with patience. And the gate, that was just the beginning. The courthouse in Hawthorne Ridge was a sandstone relic from another time. Sturdy columns, chipped at the corners, framed the steps like a gate into memory. The floor inside smelled like varnish and paper, worn down from decades of hearings, marriages and disputes. Today it was quiet, just the subtle hum of conversation between lawyers and county officials, and the rhythmic tapping of a clerk's keyboard behind the main desk. Shaquille O'Neal entered without ceremony. No cameras trailed him, no aides flanked his sides. He wore a dark blazer over a clean Henley, slacks pressed, shoes quiet against the floor. He didn't speak as he moved through the double doors into the auction chamber, just offered a polite nod to the deputy holding the clipboard by the door. Inside, rows of folding chairs lined the room, most half filled with curious locals, property scouts, and the occasional flipper looking for underpriced land. They didn't expect him. That was the beauty of it. All of this had been done in silence. No press releases, no headlines, just filings, legal pressure, time. At the front of the room, a small wooden podium held a weathered gavel and a stack of manila folders. One of them bore the number 27B in thick black marker. Constance Whitmore's estate. A 5.2-acre property with an outdated structure, overdue taxes, 2 years of neglected loan payments, and a title clouded by shell corporations and unpaid lines. Journey had taken care of the paperwork. Now all that was left was presence. Shaq took a seat, 3 rows back. Didn't fidget, didn't scroll his phone. He folded his hands in his lap, eyes steady on the podium. He wasn't here to make a scene. He was here to finish what had started the day her driveway cut across his land. 20 minutes passed before he heard her enter. The door swung open with more force than necessary, and Constance Whitmore stepped into the auction room, like she was walking into court, as the judge, not the defendant. Pearls tied around her neck, lips lined crimson, posture rigid. She scanned the room, eyes burning, until they landed on him. Shaq didn't move. She stood near the wall, arms crossed, watching as the auctioneer cleared his throat and began the docket. Property Jean 27B, Whitmore Estate, 5 acres subject to lien, foreclosure and tax seizure. Opening bid starts at silence. The room didn't know how to react. Some looked around, expecting a developer. Others confused by the number, too low for a place that had once been a landmark. A hand rose in the 3rd row. Shaq, 60, he said calmly. The clerk glanced at the sheet, nodded, and looked to the crowd. 60,000. We have 60. Do I hear 65? A pause. No response. 60 going once. Constance took a sharp breath. Going twice. She opened her mouth but no sound came. Sold. The gavel came down. It was the softest sound in the room, but it hit like thunder. Shaq stood slowly, walked to the front, and signed the transfer forms with a ballpoint pen from his breast pocket. No fanfare, no victory dance. He didn't look back as he turned to leave. But she stopped him at the door. "Wait!" she barked. He turned, and the room froze. "This was my father's land," she shouted, voice trembling with rage. "You people take and take and take."
There it was. Raw. Bitter.
Unfiltered. The last stand of a woman who had always believed her name meant ownership. Shaq's face didn't change. He didn't flinch. He looked her in the eye, calm as stone. "And yet," he said, "it was never yours to begin with." She stared at him, mouth trembling, as if the words struck deeper than she expected. Because maybe, somewhere beneath the pride, she knew it was true, knew the land her family had held so tightly was never earned, just passed down like a secret too rotten to speak aloud. Shaq didn't wait for a reply. He turned, walked out into the sunlit street, and let the courthouse doors swing shut behind him. The house stood still for 3 weeks after the auction, untouched and unentered, its shutters blinking against the wind like old eyes, unsure what they'd see next. For decades it had been the Whitmore estate, a symbol of inherited power, a place where deals were made in silence over glasses of scotch and smirks that never reached the eyes. Now it belonged to Shaquille O'Neal. But he wasn't in a rush to tear it down or gut it clean. That wasn't the kind of justice he believed in. Instead, he sat with the land first, walked it, listened. Not to ghosts, but to the echoes of everything the land had endured. The lies poured into the driveway, the sneers tossed across fences, the ugly pride that had long called this place a throne. He didn't bring wrecking crews or bulldozers. He brought stillness, and with stillness came intention. One morning, Mara returned home for spring break and walked the old Whitmore property line with her father. She kicked a pine cone across the driveway and looked up at the house with a mixture of curiosity and disgust. "You gonna tear it down?" Shaq shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "Not this time." "Why not?" "Because they need to see it. And we need to reclaim it." So began the rebirth of the property, not as a monument to wealth but as a place where truth could take root. Within weeks, contractors arrived, not to remodel the house, but to restore it. The original hardwood was preserved. The fireplace that had once warmed cold conversations now framed a community reading area. The upstairs bedrooms were transformed into classrooms. The dining hall became a space for roundtable discussions, youth meetings, and storytelling nights. They named it the Living Legacy Center, a cultural education space for kids, teens, and families in Hawthorne Ridge and neighboring towns. A place to learn real history, not the version polished for textbooks. They covered slavery, Reconstruction, the civil rights movement, black inventors, architects, leaders who had been erased or reduced to footnotes. Shaq funded it all, but he stayed behind the scenes. The spotlight belonged to the teachers, the elders, the youth leaders with voices that had waited too long to be heard. Lucille led a poetry workshop on Thursday nights. Journey held free legal clinics once a month. Even Mira got involved, organizing weekend events that brought in young people from as far as Macon. She started a podcast out of one of the bedrooms, called it Our Side of the Story. It gained traction faster than anyone expected. But through all the renovations, all the programming, Shaq made one demand. The driveway stayed exactly as it was. No repairs, no repainting, no flowers along the edge. Just cracked concrete, growing brittle under the sun. Thin weeds pushing through the seams like rebellion in green form. Nature reclaiming what concrete had once tried to dominate. And at the foot of the driveway, embedded into a stone pedestal, was a bronze plaque, clean, unmissable. This was built by hatred. We left it standing, so you'll never forget what it looked like. It became the most photographed spot in the county. Kids posed beside it. Tourists stopped on the weekends. School buses pulled up to it like it was a memorial. Because it was. Not to tragedy, but to transformation. And not once did Shaq use that plaque to talk down to anyone. He let it speak for itself. Constance never returned to the house. After the auction, she retreated into a rental home on the other side of town, far from the hill that once gave her dominance. Her name, once spoken with deference in every corner of Hawthorne Ridge, faded into whispers. Some still pitied her, others said she got what was coming. But Shaq never asked for either. He didn't buy the land to erase her. He bought it to elevate what she tried to bury. One Sunday afternoon, a group of elementary school kids sat on the lawn outside the old Whitmore porch, listening to a guest speaker from the NAACP talk about local freedom riders. The kids were loud, laughing, wide-eyed with curiosity. Behind them, Shaq stood in the shade, arms crossed, eyes soft. Lucille came to stand beside him. "Can't hear yourself think with all this noise," she said with a grin. "It's the sound of the land breathing again," he replied. She patted his back. "Your father would have been proud. You made something from the ashes." Shaq nodded. "No, I just made space. They're the ones building now." That night, after everyone had gone, Shaq walked the driveway alone. The sun was low, painting the sky in amber. He knelt near the plaque, ran his hand over the cool metal. He remembered that day. Her words, the trespass, the disbelief, the moment the law had turned its back, and he'd been left with nothing but patience and pain. Now the pain had bloomed into purpose. Not vengeance, something better. He didn't need her apology. The land had already spoken. And for the first time in a long time it was telling the right story. Shaquille O'Neal sat on the porch, elbows resting on the arms of an old rocking chair that had once belonged to his father. The wood creaked with every slow rock. But it was a comforting sound, like a heartbeat he didn't need to count. A glass of sweet tea rested near his hand. He wasn't thirsty. He was full in a different way. The house was quiet behind him. Lucille was asleep inside, the TV playing an old gospel concert at low volume. Mira had just left for the day, her voice still echoing in his mind from their earlier conversation about her next podcast episode. Down the hill, the old Whitmore house, now the Living Legacy Center, was closed for the evening. But even silent, it carried sound. It hummed with the memory of young voices, hard conversations, hope that refused to stay buried. Shaq's eyes tracked the children running through the grass. He knew every bump in that earth, every dip and ridge. He remembered planting sunflowers with his mother at the edge near the cedar stump. Remembered his father once standing barefoot in that same field, laughing with a neighbor as they hauled fence panels in the heat. That land held everything. Roots, history, blood. Not a single inch of it came easy. His voice broke the silence, low and reflective. "They planted concrete where roots were supposed to grow," he said, mostly to himself. "But even concrete cracks, and the grass always comes back." He watched a little boy fall and roll, arms wide like he wanted to hug the whole earth. The boy popped back up, grinning, and ran again. No tears, no fear, just movement. Shaq smiled. Not the kind of smile that says "I won," but the kind that says "I healed." Because that's what this had become. Not a war, not revenge, not even justice in its sharpest form. It had become a slow, patient restoration, the reclaiming of dignity, not just for himself, but for those who never got the chance, for the ancestors whose names never made it onto deeds, only onto census rolls and headstones. The land had been taken once, in different ways, through lies, through policy, through the kind of theft that hides behind progress. Constance had just been one more in a long line of thieves, who believed that concrete could rewrite lineage. But she was wrong. The grass had returned, and with it the stories. He stood slowly, joints creaking, not with age but with the weight of the day. He walked down the steps, boots brushing against wildflowers that had started pushing through the gravel path beside the porch. He moved through the field, careful not to interrupt the children's game, just a steady presence at the edge of their joy. One little girl ran up to him, big eyes missing a front tooth, her hair twisted into two proud puffs. "Mr. Shaq," she said, tugging at his hand. "Did this used to be the place where the mean lady lived?" He crouched beside her, voice gentle. "It was a place where someone forgot what land's really for." She nodded like she understood. "But we fixed it, huh?" He chuckled. "We let it fix itself." She grinned and darted back to her game. From the edge of the hill, Shaq could see everything. The house, the center, the fence still standing around that cracked driveway. It hadn't been touched. Not once. The weeds had grown taller now, some pushing through with almost poetic force, and that plaque still caught the evening light like a mirror. "This was built by hatred. We left it standing so you'll never forget what it looked like." He didn't need to look at it. He could feel it. Its truth didn't weigh on him anymore. It simply existed, like all relics should, there to teach, not to haunt. Back on the porch, Lucille had awakened. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching him in the field. "You talk to the land more than people these days," she said, smiling. Shaq looked up at her, hands on his hips. "The land listens better." She shook her head. "It just agrees with you more." They both laughed, quiet and deep, like music only they knew how to play. As twilight crept in, a few parents arrived to collect their children. One of them, a white father in paint-splattered jeans, raised a hand as he passed Shaq. Not performative, just respectful. "Appreciate what you've done here," the man said. "My boy, he loves it." Shaq nodded. "It's his land too." The man hesitated, then added, "Didn't always feel that way." Shaq didn't respond with words, just offered the kind of nod that says, "We know, we're changing it now." By the time the field emptied and dusk fully settled in, the grass was almost glowing in the moonlight. That's how it worked in places like this. The sky didn't darken all at once. It bled slowly, with softness and shadow. Shaq sat again, rocking slowly, not planning his next move, not waiting for the next fight. Just sitting, witnessing, rooted. Because the victory wasn't in the courtroom or the county records. It was in the grass, the kind that keeps coming back. No matter how many times they try to pave it down. Some fences divide, others protect. This story wasn't just fiction. It's a mirror. If it stirred something in you, don't scroll past it. Share the land, share the lesson, and remember, some roots run too deep to pave over.